Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Meadows Museum. May I please ask that everyone silence their cell phones at this time? Our speaker this evening is our curator, Nicole Atzbach, who has been with us here at the Meadows since 2010. Nicole graduated from Brigham Young University in 1998 with degrees in both art history and German. As an undergraduate, she also studied at Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg im Breisgau, where she contributed to the catalog Contours, Vases from the Berlin Collection of Classical Antiquities in Freiburg. Nicole earned her MA at Sotheby's London Institute of Art, where she focused on 17th century Neapolitan painting. She subsequently worked as curatorial assistant to the director at the Kimball Art Museum from 2002 until 2010. In addition to working on several exhibitions, she also oversaw the Kimball's Provenance Research Project under the guidance of Timothy Potts, the museum's former director. At the Meadows, Nicole has continued her work in provenance research, undertaking a multiple-year project investigating the World War II era provenance of the paintings of Santa Justa and Santa Rufina that are by Bartolomé Esteban Morillo, and the museum's marble sculpture by Auguste Rodin, among other projects. Her work in the curatorial department has covered many exhibitions, including The Prado at the Meadows, Giuseppe Rivera in a New Context, Diego Velázquez, The Early Court Portraits, The Spanish Gesture, Drawings from Murillo to Goya in the Hamburger Kunsthalle, and Sorolla in America. Most recently, in 2016, she curated Process and Innovation, Carlotta Corcoran and Janet Turner, and Between Paris and Texas, Marie Cronin, Portraitists of the Belle Epoque. Tonight, she will be speaking on her most recent exhibition, Picasso, Rivera, Still Life and the Precedents of Form, with her lecture, Radical Form, Traditional Subject, Picasso, Rivera, and the Cubist Still Life. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Atzbach.
Let me get situated here. Thank you very much, Scott, for that very kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? It's been a bumpy couple of months health-wise, so I'm very happy to be here with you all tonight. And also I wanted to thank Scott. He's filled in for me on a few different occasions during my absence for this exhibition. And we always have a very short deadline for our museum publication at the Meadows. And so he also came up with this very clever title for my talk. So thank you. Before I discuss the Cubist works that are on view in the exhibition, I want to talk just very briefly about the genre of still life and its place in the history of painting. Broadly defined, still life is a depiction of inanimate objects, either natural, such as flowers, dead animals, plants, or man-made, clocks, books, ceramics. Still life really flourished in the 17th century in the Netherlands, but actually it dates back to antiquity. We know this. There aren't any still lifes that are still extant from antiquity, but we know this through the writings of Pliny the Elder and other antique writers. In the Renaissance, still life elements could be seen in tiles. And then in the 16th century, Giorgio Vasari, an artist and a biographer, basically stated that still life really didn't have the gravitas of other types of painting, such as history painting. By the 1550s, there were painters in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, like Peter Aertsen. And what he did was what's called the inverted still life. So essentially, the emphasis of things, the religious element gets a very small portion of the canvas, and the beautiful still lifes are the feature of the painting. The same is with Joachim Beukeler and this fish market. And so eventually the religious component of the still life became absent, and it it morphed from this inverted still life to these market scenes. And then this ended up in Italy as well, in the central area of the northern part of Italy, in Lombardy in particular. And Vincenzo Campi was creating these market still lifes, and they began to be exported in vast quantities to Spain. And another famous protagonist of the independent still life was, of course, Caravaggio. And according to the Italian collector Vincenzo Giustiniani, Caravaggio stated that it was just as difficult to paint a good picture of flowers as it was to make a picture of figures. And then, of course, back in Spain, because we are the Meadows Museum, Juan Sanchez Cotan was also one of the earliest creators of independent still lifes, relatively contemporaneous with Caravaggio's own activity in the genre. And Sanchez Cotan worked in Toledo, and you can see just, the emphasis is on the relationship of these objects one with another. That is the whole essay right there, is just about how these works are placed. And then in our own collection, the still life in Spain moved from Toledo to Madrid, and we have these two works in our collection by Juan van der Hamen. And he combined northern painting, the religious subject, with his absolutely incredible observation of nature. And the poet and playwright Lope de Vega lauded van der Hamen's ability to observe nature, and he dedicated 2 sonnets to van der Hamen about how van der Hamen was able to supersede nature in his ability to reproduce it. And one more work in our collection is this wonderful still life by Campo Bean. And while still life could convey messages that were either moralistic or symbolic, the genre could also afford the painter the opportunity to display extraordinary skills of artifice, such as the gleaming copper bowl. And in the 17th century, there was an architect in France, worked for Louis XIV, and he basically established the hierarchy of genres, which this hierarchy would continue from the 17th century onward. And so you can see that history painting, religious, mythological, or allegorical, was at the top. So anything that included the human figure, because of its imitation of God, was at the top. And you see that still life is at the very bottom. And echoing this was Francisco Pacheco, who was a Spanish writer and painter, and also the teacher of Velázquez. And in his treatise, The Art of Painting, which was published in 1649, he wrote that while still life provided entertainment to its practitioners, and that occasionally good painters can amuse themselves this way, it does not lead to artistic glory. As you can see, his pupil, Velázquez, who is not yet 20, created a few different bodegones. So not an independent still life per se, but these indoor scenes of foodstuffs and people. And Pacheco himself also was known to have dabbled in still life. So we fast forward to the 20th century, and here we have Cézanne. And as in the 17th century, with still life, there weren't any rules and requirements that were associated with other painting genres. Still life served as a vehicle for its creators' unhindered creativity and formal experimentation. In his still lives, Cézanne did not strive for illusion. The focus was on the canvas and the paint. In other words, the message was that this is not an illusionistic representation, but a painted depiction. And Cézanne famously stated that painting from nature is not copying the object, it is realizing one's own sensations. So in this canvas, you can see that the table is not aligned, the right side is not aligned with the left. So he's abandoned linear perspective. He also stated that you should treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. So he was really interested in the reduction of forms to their essence. And Cézanne really was this, in his lack of mimetic representation, this disregard for linear perspective, these were really the seeds of modern art. And it was through still life that this came through. And you can also see it, of course, in his landscapes, too. It's not just still life, but still life became a genre, but it was also a metaphor for looking at how objects within a painting related one with another. And ultimately, this was a break from the idea that was put forward in the Renaissance by Leon Battista Alberti, that painting needed to be like an illusionistic window onto the world. And so it was really with Cézanne and Matisse, who we'll see later, that this got turned upside down in the 20th century. And then we can't forget Picasso's De Musée d'Avignon. This was painted in the summer, began to be painted in June, July 1907. And this is really considered to be the beginning of Cubism. Picasso called Cézanne the father of us all. And he was very inspired by Cézanne's still lifes and the relationship of the various elements with one another, this compressed, prismatic, shard-like spatial structure. And he was also influenced by objects that he saw at the Trocadero. It was this ethnographic collection that opened in Paris in 1878. And he first visited it in 1907, and he was influenced by the African and oceanic mass that he saw there. And much as Cézanne had reduced forms in his still life to their essences, Picasso reduced or otherwise distorted facial features to their essentials. And Picasso stated, a head is a matter of eyes, nose, mouth, which can be distributed any way you like. And also notice this, there is a still life element here. It's this vertiginously upturned table. So that will become a motif of these still lifes moving forward. And then Picasso and Georges Braque met later in 1907, and they developed this language that would become known as analytic cubism. And this phase really lasted until 1912, and they began then working on synthetic cubism. They got interested in collage. And then their relationship ended when Braque, of course, enlisted for the war. And though they'd see each other later, they never really had that artistic relationship one with another. And then we look at our other protagonist of the exhibition, Diego Rivera. Rivera, of course, was from Guanajuato, Mexico, and he studied there at the National School of Fine Arts. And in 1907, he went to Spain. He had received a pension from the governor of Veracruz. He stayed there for a couple of years. In Spain, he studied with Eduardo Chicharo, who was a very gifted colorist. And he went to the Prado, and he copied Goya and Velázquez and El Greco, and he was very influenced by the palettes of the Dutch and Flemish primitives. He went to Paris in summer of 1909, and then he returned to Mexico in 1910, and he had a monographic exhibition there, which was a huge success. And because of that, he was able to return once more to Europe. And he ended up in Paris. And he first exhibited in Paris at the Autumn Salon of 1911. And I just want to show you a sampling of various works that he was working on in the second decade, and just see how he arrived from basically divisionist revival to Cubism. He was very interested in the divisionist revival that was going on in Paris in 1911. He had found an apartment with his common-law wife, Angeline Beloff, and Mondrian was their neighbor. Not in just one apartment, but two different apartments. And you can see here, I'm sorry for the bad reproduction of the Rivera, but you can see this relationship. Of course, Mondrian was in this Cubist phase, and so Rivera was absorbing all of these various influences. This was a remarkable work that was shown in 1913 at Bernheim-Jeune. And this was something that he was working on. He went to Toledo and found El Greco and was hugely influenced by him. And you can also see this influence of the palettes of the Dutch and Flemish primitives that he studied at the Prado. And of course, there's also this influence of Cézanne and the stacking of figures in this very tight space. Then there's this very important work, Young Girl with Artichokes. And this was the first example of Rivera combining different views of the head and the figure simultaneously. And then you have this, again, this Cézanne influence with this upturned table. And you can see that Rivera is looking at people like Robert Delaunay and these simultaneous views that are incorporated into a single image. And then with his two women, which is at the Arkansas Art Center and was here for our exhibition on Rivera's Cubist portraits, you can see also the influence of Metzinger and Duchamp. So he's really experimenting with a lot of different types of language that are incorporated into this second phase of Cubism that was going on during the second decade of the 20th century. He finally got some notice from a very important art dealer, Berthe Weil. She was the first dealer to have sold works by Picasso in Paris. The Mexican writer Alfonso Reyes described her as an androgynous anarchist with an insect-like appearance and the protruding eyes of a Martian. And really, this was the only photo that I could find of her anywhere, so unfortunately, I couldn't find anything to contradict Reyes. But she offered Rivera in the spring of 1914 his first exhibition in Paris, and actually it would be his only monographic exhibition during his time in Paris. And there were a total of 25 works. And Berthe Weil, I think, was a powerhouse, and she was also a bit of a firecracker. There was a catalog produced for this exhibition, and there was an anonymous preface in which the author indirectly insults Picasso. Rivera found out that the anonymous writer of this preface was Berthe Weil, and so Rivera was incensed, and the gallery closed down for a few days and then reopened without the catalog. An important chronological note was that back in Mexico, Madero had become president, but after a coup d'etat in February 1913, he was murdered. And so this was the end of Rivera's government subsidy. So he really had to work that much harder to make a living. This was one of the works that was included in Berthe Weil's show, and I include it because this was setting up the famous meeting between Picasso and Rivera. So this is a portrait of Fujita and Kawashima two Japanese painters, and they were both really enamored of Isadora Duncan, the famous modern dancer, who brought Greek dress and Greek dance to Paris, to Europe. And when Rivera was painting this portrait, the Chilean painter Manuel Ortiz de Zarate came into Rivera's studio and said, Picasso wants you to come over to his studio. So all four of them, Rivera, Ortiz de Zarate, and Fujita and Kawashima, all left for Picasso's studio. And I should say that Fujita and Kawashima were dressed in togas, and they had ribbons in their hair. So that was the scene when they went to finally meet Picasso. And, sorry, we're not there quite yet. Rivera revered Picasso, and this is his account from his autobiography, My Art, My Life. I went to Picasso's studio, intensely keyed up to meet our Lord Jesus Christ. As for the man, a luminous atmosphere seemed to surround him. Picasso asked me to stay and have lunch with him, after which he went back with me to my studio. There he asked to see everything I had done from beginning to end. We had dinner together and stayed up practically the whole night talking. Our thesis was Cubism, what it was trying to accomplish, what it had already done, and what future it had as a new art. And according to Rivera, Picasso had brought Apollinaire, Greece, and Max Jacob to Rivera's studio. And Rivera would then state that Picasso's enthusiasm for my work caused a sensation in Montparnasse. Being accepted by the master of Cubism himself was, of course, a source of tremendous personal satisfaction to me. I'm gonna skip over. Got out of order. So Rivera painted Zapatista landscape in 1915, and he called it his Mexican trophy. Essentially, it was an outdoor still life. And Rivera would state that it was probably the most faithful expression of the Mexican mood that I have ever achieved. And when Picasso's close friend, Max Jacob, saw it, he mistook it at first for a painting by Picasso. And then this is a side-by-side. So Rivera on the left, standing proudly next to the Zapatista landscape, and Picasso standing with his man resting his elbows on a table, also known as man seated in shrubbery. And so this became the falling apart of the two artists. Rivera accused Picasso of plagiarizing him. You can see both works have this pyramidal structure. And then the other major contention was this shrubbery, the issue of the shrubbery gate, we can call it, or foliage gate. And this was a proprietary technique, if you will, of Rivera, this scumbling green on black. And so Rivera accused Picasso of plagiarizing from him. And this is a very faint photograph, but you can see this is the final state. This is the initial state of this painting from 1915, and this is the final state. So you can see how vastly different it is. Picasso painted out most of the shrubbery, and he all but obliterated the figure from the canvas. And this is a colored image of it. This is a wonderful drawing from the Abayo collection in Madrid, and this was at our exhibition on the Abayo collection from just a couple years ago. And this is how Picasso felt about Rivera. Picasso was having an affair. He was having an affair with a woman named Gaby Lespinasse. And so you can see him here. He's got a box of chocolates in one hand, and Gaby Lespinasse is in the apartment above, And Picasso's waiting for the all clear so that he can go upstairs. Back here, this rather corpulent figure is Rivera. And there's a dog defecating right here. So that's how Picasso felt about Rivera, not too threatened. And Jean Cocteau had a great little quote. He said, during the great period of Cubism, the Montparnasse painters barricaded themselves in their studios for fear that Picasso might carry away some seed and bring it to bloom in his own soil. In 1916, I was present at interminable confabulations outside half-open doors when Picasso took me to see them. We used to have to wait until they locked up their latest pictures. They were just as mistrustful of one another. This state of siege nourished the silences of the Rotonde and the Dôme. I remember one week when everybody was whispering and wondering who had stolen Rivera's formula for painting trees by scumbling green on black. Need to go back quickly. And I also wanted to talk about the war and the necessities of war for artists. So Daniel Henry Kahnweiler had been the dealer for Picasso, and he was, because of his German ancestry, he was forced to leave Paris, and he was in exile in Switzerland. And his inventory was sequestered. And so he began this book, Der Weg zum Kubismus, basically the way or the path to Cubism. I think it's translated in publications as the history of Cubism. He began it in 1916, and it was finally published in 1920. And he was really the one who, Picasso and Braque were his painters. And so he developed these terms of analytical cubism and synthetic cubism. And in his absence, Léonce Rosenberg, who was the brother of the famous dealer Paul Rosenberg, took advantage of Kahnweiler's absence. And in 1918, he would open the Galerie L'Effort Moderne, Gallery of the Modern Effort. And he took over part of Kahnweiler's inventory in December of 1914. And Picasso rather reluctantly agreed to work with him. Essentially, every single artist in the exhibition, Picasso, Rivera, Blanchard, Juan Gris, they all signed contracts with Léonce Rosenberg. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when you look at the exhibition and you look at the paintings themselves and how they relate to each other. There was also, a market and a need, and Léonce had certain specifications that he wanted from his artists. So how did we get from Rivera looking at Mondrian, looking at Glaze and Metzinger, to how do we get from there to Zapatista landscape? During the spring of 1915, Rivera was invited by Ramon Gomez de la Serna, who would become an important artist, important sort of leader for the Surrealists. He offered an exhibition, and Rivera and Blanchard exhibited. And this is a very not very nice caricature of the two of them. And it really tells how the Spanish audience felt about their painting. It was the first modern exhibition in Madrid, and it was not well received by the critics. So that was early 1915. And then, right before the war broke out, Rivera went with his wife, Angeline Bolaf, to Mallorca. And there he started working on these really interesting works that are in the exhibition, the still life with bread knife. And Mallorca for him was it was this immersive experience. And again, we have this combination of still life and landscape. It's almost proto-surrealist, though. It's you don't know if this blue background is the sky. You don't know if it's the sea. But there are a lot of interesting things going on here. Rivera was interested in depicting objects through their absence. And so this bottle of anise del mono is sort of cut through 3/4, and it's completed through its silhouette. And then you have these pieces of fruit where, again, they're sort of cut through, and you just have, these hints of the local color. And then in this ovoid, it has this dense carpet of this shrubbery, and you see this interesting reflection of the shrubbery. And again, this really interesting angle of the whole painting. And then the wonderful still life with gray bowl, which is on exhibition from the LBJ Presidential Library. Again, you have this carafe, and it's sort of cut through here, and then it's completed by these pink and white silhouettes. And then you have the compote, the fruit dish, and you can see the grapes here, and then their outline, the top of their outline is completed here. And these were also the years of the Mexican Revolution, which Rivera completely missed. And so there are elements of his Mexican identity. And you can see it here in this, what's called a petate. And this was a straw bed mat. And this is, a hint to his Anahuac roots. And talking about outdoor still lifes, the other major protagonist of this was Juan Gris. And this was painted in June of 1915. So this was, painted before our Meadows Picasso. And I think Rivera and Picasso were both very influenced by Place Ravignan. This is essentially Juan Gris brought the outdoors inside, and he really worked like a graphic designer. And just these beautiful passages and this synthesis. And then you can see that once again in our Gris from our collection, how he brings the outdoors indoors. And you can see these elements of buildings and trees, and they're all synthesized in this really wonderful harmony. And then this was, I think, really what all of these artists were looking at. This is an icon of early modernism, and this debuted at the Autumn Salon of 1905. And this is when the critic Louis Vaucel first described the word fauve, or savage beast, to Matisse's work. And we might look at this painting with our 21st century eyes and think, what a charming painting. But this work was really a revolution of a traditional painting trope. It was a nod to Alberti's Renaissance idea of painting as a window, a literal window. And with Matisse's non-illusionistic imagery, it was a complete break with the past. And he uses wide swaths of color. He eliminates any allusion to chiaroscuro that would create any kind of illusion of depth. And so he was a major influence to these painters. And turning back to the 17th century, speaking of Matisse, this was what Alberti was talking about, this illusionistic imagery. Painting was meant to be mimetic or illusionistic. And then this is Matisse's variation on that painting, which he completed in 1915. So you have Matisse, you have Gris, you have Picasso, Rivera, all working on these interesting still lifes, all in 1915. And Matisse had painted this earlier when he was a student at the Louvre in 1893. And you can see, you know, the geometry that's in Greece's paintings. And Leonce Rosenberg bought this canvas straight from the easel in mid-November 1915. You can see how there's multiple views of the lute. And I think Matisse was influenced by Picasso with this painting. He would have seen this work either in Picasso's studio or with Leonce Rosenberg. And then the saturated colors and the pattern passages are clear references to Matisse's work. This painting was begun in Avignon in late 1914, and it was finished in early 1915. And Picasso and Eva Guel were in Avignon, and then they ended up back in Paris. You can see this curling apple peel here, which I think is an allusion to these earlier still lifes, such as de Haim's. And then you have this wonderful little brioche, and you can think of painters like Chardin with this very huge brioche. And this is possibly sort of a tongue-in-cheek sort of reference that Picasso would have loved. This was suggested by the scholar Elizabeth Cowling. And then you look at these two paintings together, and you might think initially how different they are. I like to think of them as analogs. This is sort of, I did a little outline of this drawing, and you can see you've got the compote, the fruit dish here, and the glass. And again, you have a similar structure here with the compote and the glass. And then these are the two overlaid on one another. And so really, I think the change was Picasso looking at Rivera. And you can see that Picasso, for example, was copying Rivera's idea of this displacement of objects. For example, with the compote and the grapes here. So I think it's fair to say that Picasso is also gleaning from Rivera. And again, you have this shrubbery, of course, which also derives from Rivera. And what about the dots? What about these confetti dots? So you see this in Rivera's work as early as 1911. And when this work was exhibited at Marius de Zayas' Modern Gallery in 1916, it elicited the comment that it was one of the confetti type of pointillism. So what do the critics mean by that? So just a brief history. To celebrate the French holiday of Mi-Carême, which is a mid-Lent celebration, paper confetti began to be made in 1892 in Paris, and confetti would fill the streets, and it would fill drink glasses. Art critics began to use the term confetti as a pejorative term for what they thought to be random points of color of the pointillists and the divisionists. Picasso and Braque had begun incorporating these passages of stippling into their paintings in late 1913. And then you also have Alfred Barr, who was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art, and he coined the phrase Rococo Cubism. And it's a phrase that is rejected by most scholars today. Although, and then you can see it here on the absinthe glass. Conceptually, these Cubist dots could not be any more different from the pointillists, because the pointillists were interested in this optical mixing. And you can see how in this work, for example, it's just one color. And it's kind of interesting because absinthe, as well as the production of confetti, were both banned in France in 1915. This was a work that I tried to get for the exhibition, but it was already promised to another exhibition. But I wanted to bring it in because I wanted to talk about the portrait and its relationship with still life. And you can see how this seated man becomes part of the chair. You can see his face and you can see his arms, but everything else is essentially part of the chair. And actually, this work was first exhibited again at Marius Desias's gallery, and it was titled in that exhibition as Natur Mort, or Still Life, which I find really interesting. And really from 1911, Picasso's compositions of seated figures become an extension of still life. And then you see this seated figure by Blanchard, also from our collection. And you can see how this pattern passage here and the hair identifies the sitter as a woman. And then you see this wonderful portrait by Rivera. He began this series of Cubist portraits in 1913. And actually, Léonce Rosenberg charged more, he paid more for portraits than he did for still lifes. In this portrait, Rivera worked with them as if they were still lifes, but even more than Blanchard, he added personal elements. For example, Ilya Ehrenberg, who was a Bolshevik exile, he came from Russia to Paris in 1910. He was a writer. He turned to poetry when he got to Paris. But then with the onset of war, he began to write about the war for a Petrograd paper, and he actually worked from the front. But he had this famously disheveled mane, and he always had a pipe. If you look him up, there's a pipe or a cigarette in his hand in every photo that you can see of him. But you can really see these elements in this painting. Which brings us to the Rivera affair and Pierre Reverdy. Guillaume Apollinaire was the Cubist apologist and poet, and he enlisted for the artillery. He received a massive shrapnel wound to the head in 1917, and then he died from the influenza, in 1918. So Reverdy took Apollinaire's place. He was friends with Léonce Rosenberg. Reverdy was a fan of the early phase of Cubism, meaning Picasso and Braque, but he was not entranced whatsoever with the Cubist portrait. He declared that Cubism was an art of creation, not of reproduction or interpretation. And he wrote a scathing essay in 1917, and though he did not name anyone by name, he was really talking about Rivera when he was insulting these Cubist portraits, which to him was just an oxymoron. Léonce Rosenberg, Pierre Reverdy, Juan Gris, Rivera all went out to dinner one night, and Reverdy was insulting them. Rivera felt personally offended. He slapped Reverdy, and Reverdy pulled Rivera's hair. This essentially split Rivera from his dealer. Léonce Rosenberg took most of his paintings off the market. It split Rivera from Greece. Rivera essentially became a pariah. And this basically ended Rivera's investigation and experimentation with Cubism. After this happened, he was able to get help from the government to go to Italy, where he studied fresco painting, and then returned to Mexico, where he became one of the great muralists. So this really marked the end of his Paris period and his Cubist period. This is an epilogue, essentially, and this work, this intaglio from the Weatherspoon Art Museum. You can see again the influence of Matisse, the ongoing influence from the Collier painting. And it speaks to Picasso's uninterrupted interest in the concept of still life. And this was 1919, so Picasso had moved on. He worked with the Ballet Russe and Serge Diaghilev, and you can see this very lyrical quality of this print. And you can see how he's opened up the landscape, which is far different from the little sliver in our painting here at the Meadows. And this was an idyllic time for him. This is a recollection of his second honeymoon with Olga Koklova. And just a year earlier, Picasso was able to sign exclusively with Paul Rosenberg, Leonce's brother. And this really opened the door to financial security and worldwide recognition for the artist. And so just in summary, still life, this very lowly genre from earlier centuries, it really became a genre, a metaphor for this experimentation that began in the 20th century. And that's it. Thank you. Questions? Yes. I think it is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah. Yes. I would say it places pretty high. It's really after Cezanne, the beginning of modern art. And I think that whole period, is extremely important, not only artistically, but if you look at linguistics and how it all relates, semiotics and Saussure, and how you have the sign and the signified, and objects no longer needed to be illusionistically represented. It was really not just about this illusion, but it was about the canvas and the paint. I didn't mention it earlier, but if you look at our Picasso, you can see scratches. You can see the exposed canvas. And I think, that really changed the 20th century. I think it opened up all types of possibilities for artists, not having to cling to these centuries-old ideas of academicism and mimetic representation. And it opened the door for conceptual art, for found art. It just opened up the idea of what is art. It wasn't so structured, and I think the Cubists, Cezanne, really the ones who started that. Yes? Yes. So I just brought that in because it's an often asked question. And I mentioned the Rococo Cubism, and I didn't finish that thought. But I was saying that it's basically a rejected term, but I think what Alfred Barr, I think it was getting at not just the confetti, but the whole idea of artists looking back at earlier centuries, looking back at Chardin, looking back at these other artists, and this idea of how different it was from the analytic phase, which is these very, monochromatic works, very austere, and the synthetic cubism was this really fun, vibrant period. And I think if you look at the confetti, for me it's interesting because you have these stippled passages, and really when you have patterns, it makes something appear flat. But you can also see how sometimes Braque and Picasso both played with it. It could almost be illusionistic. And if you think, I don't know, if you think back to like the copper beam that I showed you and that gleaming copper bowl, it's like the confetti could kind of materialize to be almost this three-dimensional sort of thing. But I think they were just having fun. Also in this time, it was also like almost a commercial thing. Paul Poiret is a famous French designer, and at this 1914, he came up with these fabrics for costumes and dresses that had confetti. So I think it was something that almost represented Paris and France at this time, and this celebration. And yes. Well, 1915, they stopped making it. But it developed because of this celebration for Mi Carême, and then there were songs that were made in celebration. So I think it was something that was very evocative of the Parisian, the French spirit. Huh? I think Demoiselle is considered by many to be really the first Cubist painting for many. Yes. It's true. Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I mean, early 19th century, well, for most of the 19th century, it was very much about academicism, and then the Impressionists really broke with that. And they broke with that idea, and it was very freeing, I think, for them. And then I think Cezanne is sort of the culmination. The Post-Impressionists and then Cezanne, I think, are really the culmination of that began with the Impressionists. We could ask Richard Battelle what he thinks. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah, I don't know how many people are practicing it, but I think in terms of collecting and exhibiting and saleability, I would say absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.